There are moments in life when we feel the ground beneath us shake, when what we thought was certain begins to crumble away. The things we clung to, the structures that gave us a sense of security, suddenly seem fragile and uncertain. It is in these times that we must confront a truth that many would rather ignore. The collapse has begun, but this is not a collapse of despair, nor a sign of impending doom. It is, in fact, a necessary upheaval, a divine reckoning that paves the way for something far greater than what we could ever have imagined. The collapse we are speaking of is not of the world, nor of civilization as we know it. It is the collapse of the things within us that have held us captive, our fears, our pride, our doubts, and our misguided hopes. These are the very things that prevent us from walking in the fullness of what we were meant to be. And though the collapse may feel terrifying in its initial stages, we must understand that it is a work of God's hands. It is His mercy at work, clearing the way for new growth, new understanding, and a new purpose. As the walls around us begin to fall, we are not abandoned. We are not left to face the chaos alone. In fact, it is in the midst of this collapse that God speaks most clearly. He speaks not in whispers, but in a voice that shakes the very foundation of our lives, calling us to step forward in faith, to trust that what is being torn down will give way to something far more enduring. The collapse is not an end, but a beginning, a divine reordering of all that we have known. All that we have known. It is the necessary first step toward transformation, and though we may not understand it in the moment, we must trust that God, in His infinite wisdom, is orchestrating this moment to bring us closer to the truth of who we are meant to be. What looks like a loss is, in fact, the beginning of something far greater, a divine renewal of our hearts and our lives. It's easy to overlook the importance of moments when we feel as though the ground beneath us is shifting. Our instinct is to resist such movements, to hold tight to the familiar, to the things that make us feel stable. But what if, instead of resisting, we chose to embrace the shaking, not as a sign of fear, but as a divine invitation to step into something new, something new. The shaking, though unsettling, is often the first step toward growth. It is through the disturbance of the familiar that we are forced to reconsider what we thought was permanent and unchanging. In every life, there comes a moment when what we have known must give way to something greater. For too long, we have clung to things that, in truth, were never meant to bear the weight of our future. Relationships, ambitions, routines. These are the structures we build to give us a sense of security. And yet, if we are honest with ourselves, we know that they cannot fully satisfy us or sustain us. They were always fragile, and deep down, we've always known that. The shaking comes not to destroy us, but to set us free from the things that hinder our true growth. To embrace the shaking is to acknowledge that God is doing something in us that we may not fully understand at the moment. He is removing the false foundations we've built our lives upon and replacing them with something far stronger, something eternal. This process, though difficult, is necessary for us to step into the life He has prepared for us. We may not see it now, but the shaking is actually a form of grace. It is God's loving hand preparing us for what is to come, shaking loose the things that have held us captive so that we can walk in freedom. The shaking forces us to relinquish control. It teaches us to trust, to believe that God knows what is best for us, even when the world around us seems to be falling apart. The collapse of our old ways is not a punishment, but a merciful act of preparation. If we choose to trust Him, we will emerge from this shaking stronger, more resilient, and more attuned to His will. There is a divine plan at work when we face a collapse, whether in our personal lives or in the world around us. It is easy to become overwhelmed by the chaos and despair. Destruction, after all, seems like an end, a loss with no hope of recovery. But if we pause for a moment and look beyond the immediate rubble, we begin to see that what seems like an end is actually the beginning of a transformation that only God can orchestrate. Destruction is not something we often choose. We resist it with all our might because it is painful and disorienting. We fight against it, wanting to preserve the comfortable and familiar, not understanding that the very things we cling to may be preventing us from stepping into something far greater. When God allows the collapse, it is not because He delights in our suffering, but because He knows what is best for us. The destruction we face is a clearing away of the old so that the new can take root. This is where trust becomes essential. To see the divine plan in the midst of destruction requires us to take a step back from the emotional turmoil and ask ourselves a critical question. What is God doing here? In every storm, every earthquake, and every collapse, there is a larger purpose at work, a purpose that may not be immediately apparent to us. But God, in His infinite wisdom, is not caught off guard by the events of our lives. He knows what we need, and His plans for us are far greater than anything we can imagine. Just as a seed must be buried in the ground and undergo a process of decay before it can sprout into new life, so too must we sometimes go through a period of destruction and upheaval before we can experience the fullness of God's promises. God's promises. The destruction is not the end of the story, it is the necessary prelude to new growth. In fact, without it, we would not be ready to receive the new things God has for us. This divine plan is one of love and restoration. It may feel like we are losing everything, but what we are actually losing are the things that were never meant to last, the things that were never meant to carry us into our future. And when the rubble settles, we will find that God has already begun to rebuild, and what He builds will be stronger, more beautiful, and more aligned with His perfect will for our lives. Though disorienting and difficult is not the end, it is merely the first step toward a new beginning. When everything seems to fall apart, it is easy to believe that we are at the end of our story. The dreams we held so tightly to, the plans we worked so hard to establish, and the relationships that once seemed unshakable, all seem to be crumbling before our eyes. But in reality, the collapse is not a tragic end. It is the necessary beginning of something new, something far greater than we could ever imagine. When we are in the midst of the collapse, it can be hard to see past the devastation. The future feels uncertain, and we may wonder if we will ever be able to rebuild what has been lost. But what we often fail to realize in those moments is that the destruction is not a failure. It is a divine clearing of the ground, a necessary prelude to the new life that God is preparing for us. Just as a field must be cleared before new seeds can be sown, so too must our lives be prepared for the new season that is coming. The birth of a new beginning is not immediate. It does not come all at once, but in time, we begin to see the first signs of renewal. What seemed like an insurmountable loss gives way to new opportunities, new relationships, and a deeper understanding of God's purposes. The rubble of our old life is not the end. It is the soil in which God will plant the seeds of new growth. And as He nurtures that growth, we will see that what arises from the ashes is something stronger, more beautiful, and more aligned with His will for our lives. This new beginning is not just about rebuilding what was lost. It is about moving forward into a new season of life with greater faith, deeper wisdom, and a renewed sense of purpose. The collapse has a way of stripping away the things that were never meant to last, revealing the essentials, the things that will endure. What emerges from this process is a life that is more in tune with God's will, more aligned with His truth, and more grounded in His love. We may not fully understand why certain things had to fall apart, but if we trust God in the process, we will see that He has been at work all along, preparing us for something greater. The collapse is not a sign of abandonment. It is a sign of God's faithful commitment to making us who we were always meant to be. His plans are not hindered by the collapse, they are furthered by it. What we see as an end, God sees as the beginning of something new and beautiful. In the end, we must trust the process. The collapse is not the final chapter of our story. It is the first step toward a new beginning. As we rebuild, we will find that the foundation of our lives is stronger, more resilient, and more rooted in God's eternal purposes. The road ahead may not always be easy, but if we trust in God's timing, His plan, and His ability to bring new life from the ashes, we will see that the collapse has not destroyed us, but has made us ready for the greater things He has in store. As we conclude, we can find peace in knowing that the collapse, as difficult as it may be, is not the end of our journey. It is the beginning of a new chapter, one that is filled with hope, renewal, and the promise of a future that is far greater than we could ever have imagined. The shaking of our world, the crumbling of our plans, and the destruction of what we thought was secure are all part of God's perfect design. Through it, He is shaping us, refining us, and preparing us for a life that is rooted in His truth, His love, and His purpose. Trust the process, for what lies ahead is far greater than anything we could have hoped for. When we experience the collapse in our lives, we are often confronted with our own limitations and weaknesses. These moments of fragility can feel humiliating, as if we are exposed in our vulnerability, unable to do anything on our own. Yet, paradoxically, it is often in our weakest moments that God's strength is most clearly revealed. Our natural instinct is to build up walls of protection around us, to present an image of strength to the world, and to maintain control at all costs. But when everything we relied on begins to crumble, we are forced to face the truth. We are not as strong as we thought, nor are we meant to be. It is in our weakness, when we have nowhere to turn but to God, that His power is made perfect. The Apostle Paul, in his own struggles and sufferings, came to understand that when he was weak, then he was strong. This is not a contradiction, but a profound truth. The power of God is made manifest in our humility and surrender. In the midst of collapse, we find that it is not our self-sufficiency that will carry us forward, but God's sufficiency. We learn to lean not on our own understanding or abilities, but on God's infinite grace. In our fragility, we discover that God's strength is more than enough to carry us through. And when we finally release our desire to control, we find that we are filled with a power that is not of our own making, a power that transforms our weakness into victory. Rather than shying away from moments of vulnerability, we are invited to embrace them as opportunities to experience God's strength in ways we could never have imagined. When we are stripped of all our pretensions, we stand before God in our rawness, ready to receive His power and grace. The collapse then becomes a doorway through which we enter into a deeper dependence on God, allowing His strength to sustain us in the midst of our struggles. One of the most transformative aspects of experiencing a collapse is the new perspective it gives us. When everything we once held dear begins to fall apart, we are forced to reassess what truly matters. The things we took for granted, the priorities we once cherished, and the dreams we thought would define our lives, suddenly they lose their significance. And though the shift may feel unsettling, it also provides us with a precious opportunity to reorient our lives toward what is truly important. God, in His wisdom, often allows the collapse to occur in order to recalibrate our vision. We become so caught up in the pursuit of worldly goals, the accumulation of things, and the validation of others that we lose sight of the eternal truths that should guide us. In the midst of the collapse, God helps us see beyond the temporary distractions and refocus on the things that truly matter: our relationship with Him, our love for others, and the purpose He has placed in our lives. What we thought was crucial may turn out to be fleeting, and what we once overlooked may now shine with eternal significance. The gift of perspective allows us to see that the collapse is not a random event or a sign of failure, but an act of divine love. Through this reorientation, God is helping us to shed the superficial aspects of life and embrace a deeper, more meaningful existence. When we choose to see the collapse in this way, we no longer view it as a setback, but as an opportunity for growth, renewal, and a more profound understanding of God's will. The collapse, then, serves as a divine wake-up call, shaking us from our complacency and urging us to reassess our priorities. It offers us the chance to live with greater intentionality, to pursue what is eternal rather than what is temporary, and to realign our hearts with God's purpose for our lives. Through this new perspective, we are able to emerge from the collapse with a clearer vision and a deeper commitment to living in accordance with God's truth. In conclusion, the collapse we face in our lives, though painful and unsettling, is not a sign of defeat, but a powerful invitation to transformation. It is in these moments of upheaval that we are called to embrace the shaking, knowing that God is clearing the ground for something far greater than we could have imagined. The crumbling of what we thought would endure is not a tragedy. It is part of a divine process of rebuilding, refinement, and renewal. Through the collapse, we are given the opportunity to trust God's perfect timing, understanding that His ways are higher than ours, and His plan for our lives is always unfolding in the best possible way. We learn to surrender our need for control, trusting that God's strength will be made perfect in our weakness. We discover that it is through our fragility that we experience the fullness of His grace and power, and that His love never falters, even when everything else seems to crumble. The collapse also gifts us with a new perspective, one that helps us see beyond the transient distractions of life and focus on what is truly eternal. It is through this divine reorientation that we find our lives realigned with God's purpose, with a clearer vision and a deeper understanding of what truly matters. What seemed like an end is, in fact, the beginning of a new chapter, a new season where God is at work in us, preparing us for greater things. We must trust the process, even when it feels difficult, and know that God is not finished with us yet. The collapse is not a sign of his absence. It is a sign of his presence, his love, and his unshakable commitment to our growth and well-being. It is through the breaking down that we are made ready to receive the new, the better, the eternal. And in the end, we will look back and see that the collapse was not the end of our story, but the beautiful beginning of a life that is more deeply rooted in God's truth, love, and purpose. So, let us stand firm in the midst of the shaking, knowing that with God the collapse is never the final word. It is only the beginning of the greater work he is doing in and through us.